Friday seminar. This is week 8, and my name is Miguel Figliozzi. I'm a professor in civil engineering, and today we have a guest speaker coming from Arizona State University, Mikkhail, and he's an expert, has a long resume working on sustainable life cycle analysis and systems, energy, and very interesting resume. And so today he's going to be talking about parking redevelopment in California and some opportunities and challenges. So,
thank you. So thank you all. Happy to be here. So Mikkhail, I go by Mike. I've been at Arizona State University in civil, environmental, and sustainable engineering for 5 years now. And what I wanted to do today was sort of give you, instead of just doing one project and talking to you for 40 minutes about a single project, which would be the one that is on the title of this slide right here, what I was going to instead do, or what I will instead do, is kind of walk you through how I arrived at doing this project, and then I will describe to you the project itself. So hopefully as graduate students you can see kind of the progression in thinking of why I'm studying what it is that I'm studying. I'm going to talk largely about infrastructure growth in the next 40 minutes. It's a topic that I find fascinating. So I started off doing and I still do a lot of work in the area of transportation lifecycle environmental assessment. So I'll give you a sense of what this means, but this is basically work that I started as a graduate student about 12, 13 years ago when I was at Berkeley. And it's the idea that transportation systems, in order for a vehicle to move, you need the vehicle itself, you need to produce energy, you need infrastructure, and then there's the tailpipe emissions. When we add all those things together, you get a slightly different picture than if you were to just strictly look at the tailpipe of the vehicle. So, I'll start there and kind of give you a little bit of sense of the work that I did there. I then transitioned into what I'm calling infrastructure growth modeling. The life cycle assessment kind of opened up questions about why it is that I was looking at infrastructure the way that I was looking at it. So as a faculty member at ASU, I started thinking about, why does the city that we study in terms of sustainability or resilience or energy or whatever it is, fill in the blank, why does it look the way that it does? And the answer to that question is often wildly unclear. And you'll see that when I talk about parking. It's the result of, decades, if not centuries, of decisions and policies and technical forces and so on, which are fascinating when you begin to unpack and ultimately lead to you thinking about what I would call gating functions, which is how much can we do given the sort of obduracy or embeddedness of infrastructure that's in place already. Most recently, being in Arizona, you might suspect that it's difficult not to think about climate. So climate change has become a major thrust. Now I have the sort of tools to think about infrastructure, and that sort of positions me to work in the area of infrastructure and climate change. So a lot of my work now, I would say more than half of the work that I'm doing focuses on questions of how do we prepare cities, how do we redesign and adapt infrastructure for resilience to climate change, not just in terms of extreme heat, but in terms of urban flooding, coastal flooding, wildfires, so on and so forth. And that has brought me kind of away from the transportation area, which is fine. I'm looking at infrastructure across water and power and multiple systems that are interdependent. I want to note here before I get going, I'm not going to talk about this at all today. It requires sort of its own hour at least. But this work is largely within what's called the Urban Resilience to Extreme Sustainability Research Network, SRN. 3 of these were awarded. The one on urban resilience to climate change is one that I am co-leading with a number of your faculty, specifically Thad Miller and Vivek Chandis. So there's a nice ASU, Portland, as well as 15 other universities that are involved in that research effort. And I'm happy to talk to you more about it after the seminar is over. So let me try to walk you through kind of how I get to studying parking. And then we'll talk for probably half of the lecture about the actual parking study, which is focused on Los Angeles. So as a graduate student at Berkeley, starting in the mid-2000s, the field of life cycle assessment was sort of really picking up. And transportation folks were really adopting this framework, as I would call it, to help them understand the environmental impacts of different decisions, emerging technologies, emerging fuels, and so on. Biofuels were a big deal then because we were subsidizing corn ethanol pretty heavily at the time. And life cycle assessment became this sort of unifying framework by which we tried to assess transportation systems. So, I come along as a graduate student, and my advisor says to me, life cycle assessment is great. We've been thinking about it in terms of this, this, and that. But one of the dimensions that we haven't really tackled at all is infrastructure. So how does infrastructure contribute to environmental impacts within the life cycle of transportation systems? So that became my PhD, and ultimately a lot of my postdoc work was focused on this question. So, the basic idea is that a transportation system requires, you often hear it described as rolling stock, right-of-way, and, basically rolling stock, right-of-way, and passengers. But you can sort of recast that as vehicles, infrastructure, and energy production when you're thinking about the life cycle of transportation systems. And at the time I had started the work, almost nothing had been done there. Matter of fact, my PhD proposal, my dissertation proposal, I remember in 05-ish, had like a lit review table, and it showed who had done what in certain areas, and infrastructure was totally blank, whereas these other two had stuff in it. So, when you account for all of these different components, of which, for any one of these, there could be dozens or, even 50 to 100 different components that all take in energy and produce environmental impacts. Not only that, they have supply chains. And when you start factoring all of those things in together, you start to see a slightly different footprint for the environmental intensity of various transportation modes. So here's some of the early life cycle work I did, the first study which came out in 2009. Anything that's gray is a tailpipe emission. That's, up until then what we had taken as the footprint of that transportation system. So a conventional gasoline sedan was emitting about 144 grams of CO2 per passenger kilometer traveled, with an average of something like 1.5 passengers on a vehicle. Anything that's blue is vehicle-related, manufacturing, maintenance. Anything that's red, orange, pinkish is infrastructure-related. Anything that's green, it's hard to see the color here, but this green here is energy production. So that's the idea that in order to get gasoline, for example, in your car's gas tank, upstream energy and environmental impacts are produced just to get that in the form of extracting fuel, refining it, transporting it, so on and so forth. So colors are life cycle, and grays are the tailpipe, right? So now you can see a car. Okay, that's 144 in the tailpipe, but when you factor in the life cycle, you get up to like 250-ish, 240, 250, and all of a sudden the life cycle, gives you a slightly different picture of what might be going on, right? So it's important to think about it. And for some of these systems, the infrastructure processes are really big. See that? Lots of red, orange, pink. For a rail system, for example, the infrastructure itself can make up half the footprint, life cycle footprint of that vehicle, right? Which is a sort of commentary on the amount of infrastructure that's invested to move a certain amount of passenger kilometer travel by various modes, right? So for rail, we have a heck of a lot of infrastructure, usually a little bit shorter distance travel, right? So the passenger kilometer travel aren't all that high. So I did this work, and I've done this work, any which way you can imagine. I've done it for U.S. transportation systems. Here's average U.S. aircraft, trains, automobiles, buses. I've done it for high-speed rail. I've done it for metro systems in Los Angeles and Phoenix and Boston. I've worked with TriMet here. I've worked with a number of folks over the course of about a decade doing this sort of work. And finally, I got to the point where I said to myself, why do I care about this? Why do I care about this infrastructure? Okay, it's got a footprint. You can't operate the vehicle without it. I get it. But can we think about this a little bit more critically? Because the reality is that the way that you design infrastructure ultimately has profound effects on how we travel, for example, throughout the city, right? So we can design infrastructure in various ways, whether it's automobile infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, a combination of the two, rail infrastructure, which ultimately may lead to inefficiencies or efficiencies in the environmental intensity of these respective systems, right? So I started sort of shifting how I was positioning infrastructure, instead of as a kind of artifact of the things that are needed in order for there to be travel, to an actual set of decisions, and whether they be technological decisions or non-technological decisions that ultimately affect how we use the transportation systems, how we achieve mobility, accessibility, and ultimately the environmental footprint, whether you classify that under sustainability or not, of urban activities, right? So that's where that sort of line of thinking went from. I published those results in '09, and I got this very polite email from a gentleman named Todd Littman at the Victoria Transport Policy Institute. I see a few people nodding because you've probably read his work. Todd does some very nice work where he basically will kind of aggregate a lot of information on very complex things and make it very sort of accessible to people. And he sent me this very polite email that said, I think you got parking totally wrong. So buried in here for a car should be parking, right? It should be roads, it should be parking. So I factored all that stuff in. I won't go into all the details, but parking is in there. So I get this email and he says, you used 105 million parking spaces across the U.S. for all passenger vehicles. He said, I think you totally underestimated it. Does anybody want to agree or disagree? Why?
Because there's far more parking spaces just in homes.
Far more parking spaces in homes, okay?
More than 100 million homes in this country.
Good. So there's over 100 million homes, and pretty much every single one of them has at least one parking space, right? You could frame that differently. You could say, how many vehicles are there in the U.S.? Light-duty vehicles. 350 million? Why?
Because we never stopped producing them.
Because what's the population of the U.S.? Okay, it's somewhere, I think it's like 320-ish, 310, 320. And not all of those are drivers, right? So, you know, a large fraction do have a driver's license. We have more vehicles than we have registered drivers. So, you know, say there's 250, 300 million vehicles in the U.S., right? And at any given time, like my car right now, whenever I ask this question in Phoenix, everybody owns a car. I'm afraid to ask this in Portland. I think it might be the opposite. But for the most part, we have pretty much everybody in the U.S. owns a car, right? There's more registered vehicles than there are registered drivers. We know that for sure. So the cars are usually not being driven, right? So my car is parked right now. Even when I'm using it in Phoenix, I'm driving it maybe 30 minutes a day. So there's 23 hours and 30 minutes of the day when it's not being used. Are you familiar with these statistics? If you've studied parking, you've kind of heard this. So the majority of the time a car spends, the majority of the car's life is spent parking, right? It's not actually moving, it's parking. So this is where shared vehicles and autonomous vehicles may come in and allow us to more meaningfully use that time when it's not being used, but then also maybe get rid of some parking infrastructure along the way. So he said, you better take another look at this. So I said, okay, I'll take another look at this. And I said, all right. You know, quickly I realized it's not 105 million, but nobody had an estimate of how much parking existed in the United States. It just didn't exist. So the only number that was out there was 105 million, and that came from this sort of consortium of parking unions. It was essentially the folks who are unionized and are responsible for metered parking spots in cities, right? A very small fraction of the total parking area. So of these 105 million, you know, we said, all right, there's probably a lot more, and we got to quantify this because really nobody has any idea how much parking infrastructure exists in the United States. 105 million was one estimate. There were a handful of surveys that had been done of central business districts of cities. Those are the other estimates. So somebody had actually gone out in various cities and had counted parking spaces in CBDs. That's all we knew about parking. I mean, imagine how much money we invest in this infrastructure. Imagine how pervasive this infrastructure is, which I'll show you in the course of this talk. And we had no idea how much of it existed, right? Some would argue that minimum off-street parking requirements are probably the most dominating force in urban form and land use over the past 50 to 80 years. And we have no idea how much parking exists out there. So, you know, you'll see this one too, 99. If you take the National Household Travel Survey, you can very quickly calculate that most trips start or end in free parking. All right, so we said, all right, let's count. Let's figure this out. Let's come up with a reasonable estimate. So we started with the 105, and we said, all right, that's clearly low. Each of these is about 10 million spaces, if I did this right, roughly. Then, what if we take those metered spaces, and we add to it, everybody has a home spot, and pretty much everybody has a work spot for parking. Most people drive to work. I don't know the actual number, but let's add those two in. And then let's also add in commercial space. And there's some overlap, which we take care of. I won't go into the details. But let's add in these sort of zoning square foot requirements that say for every so many square feet of different types of commercial space, you need to have so many off-street parking spaces. Okay? When you add all those together, 730 million. So you see the parking spaces increasing down here. All right, so there's another estimate, 730 million. We said, all right, can we do this differently? Not only that, but there's also on-street spaces. And on-street spaces get into this real gray area where, what is an on-street parking space? So most on-street parking spaces are not metered. They're actually unmetered spaces, often unmarked, right? Often they don't actually have paint that delineates the space. So if you go outside of the core of an urban area, think about residential local streets. What can be parking, sometimes is parking, sometimes isn't, you have to sort of count that up. So we did this whole sort of, analysis of what is on-street spaces. Let's look at urban versus non-urban areas. And let's try to add that up. So when you add that in, 820 million. Okay? Then we said, there had been a bunch of surveys of parking in the United States in urban versus rural settings. So I told you counting of parking spaces in CBDs. There have been a handful done by some folks at Purdue for rural areas. And they came up with these sort of estimates of 4 spaces per car in urban areas and about 2.2 spaces per car in rural areas. So then if we take the weighting of those and we apply it to urban and rural areas in the United States, what do you come up with? So this is sort of a validation against this right here, right? It's a totally different approach. Will it come out to be about the same, a little bit different? 840 million. All right, so we're kind of zeroing in on this 800 million parking spaces for about 250, 300 million vehicles, right? But then there's all this other gray space, gray paved area that could be parking spaces that we're not sure if it's actually used as parking. It can be, but it often isn't. There's sort of shoulders of roads across a lot of the U.S. What is it? There's 3 million miles, 4 million miles of roads. I think I have that number right. And all of those shoulders could, or a lot of those shoulders could be used for parking. So we said, all right, let's consider that as well. And then one other number that appeared pervasive in the literature was in urban planning literature. I don't know if you guys have seen this. 8 spaces per car. This appears all over the planning literature when you look at kind of estimates of how much parking is out there. And when you trace that number back, what you might suspect happens is, it goes to this like 1983 study where somebody just sort of said, I guess there's probably about 8 spaces per car, but there was never any actual science or rigorous methodology behind it. So 8 spaces per car times 250 million vehicles, 2 billion. So, if you're between this 800 million and 2 billion, you're in this sort of gray area where, you might be you might be counting local roads and the shoulder on local roads. So, we did that and we said, okay, it could be 800, it could be, 1.5 billion, but it's a lot. It's a lot more than 100, right? And not only that, but when you add that into the life cycle of the vehicle, so now me being called out by Todd Littman where he said, go back and double check this and see what it does. So here's PM, particulate matter emissions, which we care about for respiratory effects. Here's what the parking inventory does in the life cycle. Next, here's tailpipe emissions, construction, maintenance of roadways, parking, right? So it's a lot of construction activities, mining of resources, those sorts of things, which ultimately release PM emissions. And when you allocate that to a passenger mile of travel in this case, it's actually pretty significant. And we then said, okay, there we go. We have a decent estimate of parking in the U.S., and we have a decent estimate of what the environmental impacts might be when you have these sort of different scenarios. So, that sort of gave me a taste for parking, right? And I came out of this and I said to myself, all right, we have parking, a decent estimate for the U.S., but we know nothing about cities, right? And as I started transitioning and looking at cities, I started saying to myself, we need to have a more rigorous understanding of where parking is in cities and why it grew to be what it is today. So there were a series of studies that I did over the past 3 or 4 years. I'll show you one on roads to give you a flavor of how infrastructure grows. So I would argue to you that as we get into things like urban sustainability, and we're talking about how we use that infrastructure, it's very difficult to define the trajectory of urban infrastructure without understanding the forces that made infrastructure into what it is today, right? So if you look out at the city around you, and I ask you guys the question of, why does Portland look the way that it does? It's wildly complicated to figure out the answer to that. It's a result of not only technologies, right, but political forces, cultural forces, social forces, economic forces that have come together over decades, if not centuries, to create the urban environment that you see around you today. So we said, all right, let's look at Los Angeles. And I'm going to focus on Los Angeles going forward for a couple of reasons. One, because, as I'll show you in a minute, the infrastructure of Los Angeles is mature. Los Angeles is a young city, but I'll give you evidence that the infrastructure has matured. And by mature, I'll mean that we're not adding more cumulative infrastructure anymore. The total amount of infrastructure in the case of roads or even buildings has sort of flattened off. We're certainly replacing it as we rehabilitate it, but we're not adding more, for example, lane miles of roads. This is starkly different than a place like Phoenix, where the infrastructure is still growing. So for perspective, those of you who don't know Phoenix, wildly interesting city for urban planning and even engineering. We are at 5.5 million people today. I'm guessing that's bigger than Portland. That's the metro area, 28 cities in the metro area. We were at 1.5 million in 1990, over a tripling of population in 20 years. A lot of that is met by new infrastructure. It's nice and easy to use that infrastructure. For example, roads are smooth, buildings are new, things are not congested yet. I think that Phoenix is essentially 30 years behind Los Angeles. Los Angeles, I think, is basically saturated infrastructure about 30 years ahead of Phoenix. So how do we figure out how infrastructure has grown? We're going to do this largely from a technical analysis where we said, how can we actually see how infrastructure has gone in? So what we did is we said, all right, well, when do roads go in? Any thoughts? How would you figure out how would you tag a link of a road with a year of construction or age? Development around it. That's exactly what we did. So we said, if you look at the age of buildings around it, which you know a lot more about because assessor databases provide you with fairly rich information about all of the buildings in a city down to the actual building, sometimes parcel, usually building. And the assessor databases, you guys have probably used them to some extent, are basically the sort of database that we have of buildings in a city, which are used for tax purposes. So they give you all sorts of rich information about the building infrastructure. So we did this GIS analysis where we actually assigned the building ages or vintages to the nearby roadway links under the assumption that probably the buildings went in around the same time that road was constructed. You didn't usually build a neighborhood without roads. So when you do that, here you can see the growth of roads in Los Angeles. Green is old, dark green is old, yellow is newer, orange is the newest. So you see that sort of outward sprawliness. You're going to see a theme here that this is downtown, what I will call the urban core of Los Angeles. The central business district is right here. So this is the oldest part of the city. And when I say Los Angeles, I'm going to mean the county going forward, which is what you see there. The Los Angeles metro region, I think, spills over into 6 counties, which includes like Orange County, Ventura County, Santa Barbara, all that around it. So here's the growth of roadway infrastructure. And then when we actually look at the cumulative deployment of roads, so this is in any given year how much road, in this case kilometers, existed, you see is this S-curve, right, which tells you that roads were put in fast, 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 and then slowing down, and then flattened off. So this is what I'm calling the maturation of infrastructure. So basically, at some point, we had put in as many roads as we could put in Los Angeles County, and at that point, we had shifted from a model of capital construction to a model of rehabilitation. That happens around 1990. What we then did is we said, how much did all this cost, and how much will it cost going forward? And what we did is we back calculated the capital construction costs and the maintenance costs. And what you see is a shift in the paradigm of financing, which you might suspect. So early on, by the way, 74% of roads go in between 1930 and 1970. I think if you did this for Portland, you would probably see something similar. I don't know if the time periods would align, but you'd probably see this S-curve where Portland's, for the most part, built out. But what you see is capital investments, little on maintenance because you have brand new infrastructure that is Phoenix today. And then, all of a sudden, no more capital investments. They sort of dwindle out, and you're left with rehabilitation and maintenance costs going forward, which if you didn't put money in the bank, like most state or regional DOTs didn't do, you're stuck with how do we pay for the infrastructure that's in place, right? We got money for capital investments, but we didn't think about long-term financing, and now we're stuck with a model that we can't actually sustain. So the infrastructure growth kind of brings us to the talk today. And I'm going to give you a sense of how we modeled the growth of infrastructure, parking infrastructure in Los Angeles. Then I'll talk about the kind of implications of it, what I think it means. This was a project that I did with my graduate student, with a colleague at University of California, Los Angeles, Juan Matute, Ram Pendiala, who was a professor at ASU in civil engineering. He's now at Georgia Tech, but ASU is so awesome that he's coming back. And Carolyn Flower, who was an undergraduate researcher with us, who was at Dickinson College. So the five of us worked on this study. It's not all my work. I'm going to give credit where credit is due. The study is published in the Journal of American Planning Association, which is not a place that engineers usually publish, but it was the right place for me to publish. The editors voted it the #2 JAPA paper of 2015, so I'm kind of happy about that. It was a grueling process. I had to rewrite it 4 times at the request of the head editor, but it came out to be a great paper. There are a number of categories of parking that you have to model when you're thinking about the historical growth of parking. Okay, so there's residential off-street, there's non-residential off-street, and then there's on-street parking, right? Those are the big 3 ones. And you have to sort of model them in different ways. So, for example, with residential or non-residential off-street, what we did is we took the assessor databases, we looked at the sort of building use codes, and we said, all right, based on the use codes, let's look up the minimum off-street parking requirements, and let's do that historically. And based on some building growth modeling that we had done, building turnover and growth modeling that we had done for Los Angeles, we were actually able to know how many buildings or certain types of buildings existed in certain areas of the city at certain times. And we aligned that with historical minimum parking requirements for different use codes of land use. Make sense? So there was a regime of parking requirements that existed until about 1936. That sort of shifts. 1936 to 1960, you have a different regime of parking requirements. And then that shifts again post-1960. So we dug all this stuff up. A lot of people had kind of looked at this in the past, and we were able to piggyback off of them. But we dug all this stuff up, and we were able to apply these, 1 space per 400 square foot for a medical facility constructed pre-1936 type of estimate, right? So this allows us to estimate the number of off-street parking spaces historically through today. On-street. On-street isn't so simple when you actually get down to brass tacks, okay? So, yeah, it's basically the shoulders of roads, and when you're in the sort of urban core of the city, most of that shoulder is used for parking. However, don't forget that there are like these buffers at intersections that you can't park within so many feet of the intersection, right? There's fire hydrants, there's bus stops, there's all sorts of driveways, all sorts of stuff that has to be taken out of the on-street inventory that isn't actual parking spaces. And that was a beast of a GIS analysis that was done by one of my graduate students. So this gives you a sense of, the red are kind of areas of the road that were taken out for various reasons. So all sorts of layers of fire hydrants and bus stations and bus stops. And then we had to account for driveways, which was not that easy either. The width of driveways changes over time, stuff like that. So we did our best guess, and that's how we do the on-street estimate. Surface lots and structures. So some of this can come from the assessor database, but the assessor database is really bad. Assessor databases are really bad at coding comprehensively parking structures and lots. So basically, in an assessor database, what you'll get are garages or multi-story structures and surface lots whose parcel is dedicated to that land use. But when you have facilities that are not dedicated to parking, for example, a building with a parking lot, it doesn't get tagged as such in the assessor database, right? And that's the majority of actual parking structures. So we did a few things. One, we mined what's called the ParkMe database. So there's a nice kind of crowdsourced database for Los Angeles where you can actually see live parking availability and parking prices. It's a cool website. So we actually mined this, and we were able to use that as sort of validation against the assessor databases and against the sort of minimum off-street requirements from the previous study, previous part. All right, so what do we get? Remember, residential off-street, non-residential off-street, and on-street spaces. Here's the growth of parking across Los Angeles County from 1900 to 2010. This is millions of spaces. So you can see that growth. It's happening, slowly, and then minimum off-street parking standards come in the 20s or so. It kicks up, and then it sort of starts to slow down, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. Does everybody know the history of minimum off-street spaces? Probably no, right? The planners, I'm guessing, have been exposed to it somewhat. So in the 20s, 30s, the dominant technology of the time becomes the automobile in terms of mobility, right? So it takes off, it becomes cheaper, the technology matures, and people start adopting it. Dominant technology and infrastructure are very highly interrelated. It's important not to separate those two things. So people are using cars, but there's no off-street parking spaces. Can we even fathom what this is like? There's no off-street parking spaces. I mean, we can't even imagine urban form like this for the most part. So where do you park cars? On the street, right? And what does that do? It creates congestion because it creates kind of a bottleneck. It slows down the other cars from driving through. Now that's a desirable thing. But back then, in the 20s and 30s, that was not a desirable thing. So not only that, cities weren't designed for cars. Cities had short blocks. The roadway widths and such were not designed for fast thoroughfares of automobiles. So we start redesigning things in the code, right? And we, in many cities across the U.S., we started instituting minimum off-street parking requirements. And there's a sort of list of things. I'm not an expert on this topic, but the sort of punchlines are that most of this parking is free and it's abundant. Okay, and it's free in the sense that you don't pay directly for it; you pay indirectly for it, meaning that it's bundled in your rent. For example, if you have a free parking spot at your apartment, if you go to Target and there's a big surface lot, it is bundled into the price of goods, and whether or not you drive, you pay for parking. And that, some would argue, is a distorting force in our choice of mobility, right? So if parking is free for auto drivers, then we may choose to drive more, sort of thing. That encourages people to adopt automobiles, which then creates congestion, which counteracts the original intention of minimum off-street parking requirements. Okay? So that's the history. If you're to take, so it's about 18.6 million spaces, 5.5 residential off-street. The bulk is non-residential off-street. Some of the most egregious land uses, anybody want to guess what they are? Think about things that are infrequently used but have tons of parking. Stadiums, like sporting events. What else? There's another one that you only go one day a week to it at most. Religious establishments. Tons of parking, infrequently used. Okay? So lots of parking dedicated to it, lots of people going there for a particular day or a particular time, but the rest of the time, just a big open lot. It's about 5.6 million vehicles in LA, so it's roughly 3.3 spaces per vehicle. Okay, so you'll see this number appear in the literature. In the US, it's roughly 4 spaces per vehicle. Here, 3.3, in some places a little bit less. we published a study, it got some press. It's amazing what people focus in on. I thought, what was unique about this study was we were capturing the growth of parking. What everybody else thought was interesting was that we said 14% of Los Angeles's incorporated area is covered with parking. And somebody even was, in one of the articles, did a big circle in Google Maps to represent the land area that is covered, if you were to express it that way, which isn't wholly accurate because you have multi-story parking structures, right? So this is what LA would look like if that 14% was spread out. By the way, that's more land area for parking than it is for the traveled wave roads, which is consistent with the study that I showed you for the United States. Okay? So this is what I was getting at before, the importance of understanding infrastructure. There's more asphalt infrastructure for parking than there is for roads, and we often have no idea how much of it is out there. Here's the addition of parking spaces over time. And you'll notice that between 1940-ish and 1990 is when the bulk of parking went in, which corresponds largely to when you saw the growth of Los Angeles, roughly in that time period, right? About 300,000 spaces per year were added during that 50 years. Right now, we're down to about 100,000 spaces per year being added. So we've seen this large decline. What's interesting to me is to think about what would happen if this goes to zero. No more space additions. We're just maintaining or maybe even removing the existing parking supply that's already there. Growth relative to lane miles. So this is, if you take the 1945 number for any one of these total spaces, non-residential off-street, VMT, and lane miles, this is essentially an index relative to 1945, how much growth there's been. So what you see from this is that non-residential off-street spaces and total spaces have outpaced, the growth of those have outpaced the growth of roadways. They are less than the growth in VMT. And by the way, there's peak travel for you. Whether or not that stays like that, who knows. But that's your peak travel effect. So VMT is greater. Lane miles is fewer. So you see parking outpacing those. And I'm not saying that parking is causing VMT. I want to be careful here. We didn't actually do a study that correlated those two. But you do see that it could be a contributing factor which deserves some more attention. Similarly, growth relative to vehicles. Total parking spaces, residential off-street spaces right here, which are kind of tracking to each other. And vehicles kind of track to that a little bit faster. And what I'm going to show you in a minute is, as of 1975, what we found was that the growth in vehicles tracked essentially one-to-one to the growth in residential off-street parking spaces. If you want to get rid of vehicles, get rid of residential off-street parking spaces. And I'll give you a few more sort of tidbits about that in a minute. Changes in spaces. Most of downtown LA was built up by 1950. And since 1950, which is when we're able to do spatially explicit analyses, because that's when the data become available to us, most of the parking post-1950 happens outside of the urban core, as we've called it. And this is really interesting because higher levels of automobile adoption are associated with these neighborhoods, higher levels of automobile ownership and automobile use. Okay? But the greatest density of spaces, which you'll see in a second, remains focused on the urban core. 1950, 1970, this is residential off-street, 1990, and 2010. It's going to keep looping through. So this is residential off-street spaces per square mile. And you can see in 1950, it was concentrated in the urban core, greatest density. And then you see sort of an evening out as parking expands outwards. Currently, there's about 5,000 residential off-street spaces per census block, on average, per census block in LA. About 11,000 spaces per total spaces per census block. A lot of parking, okay? I don't know if you guys have heard this term, the coverage factor. So this is a measure of the area of asphalt devoted to parking divided by the total area of the region. Okay, so in this case, the census blocks. What we found is, so a percentage of 9.7% means that 9.7% of your land area is covered with parking in a region. Notice that it can go over 100% because of multi-story parking structures. There's about 28 census blocks in LA County that go over 100%. 18 of those are in the urban core, essentially in the central business district, which are basically small census blocks, small areas that have multi-story parking structures on top of them. So to sort of tie this up, minimum parking standards, you could say, have been a success at encouraging automobility and probably a failure at lowering congestion. We didn't directly do this analysis, but the evidence supports this statement going forward. Before 1975, you had more parking than you had basically more residential off-street parking than you had vehicles. People adopted fast to make up for that. And by 1975, the number of vehicles, the growth in the number of vehicles is about equal to the growth in the number of residential off-street parking spaces. Okay? So this has hovered around unity for a while. One of the other interesting things that we see is that when you take parking spaces away from regions, vehicles tend to disappear. Either people get rid of their cars or they move to neighborhoods where there's more parking, and vice versa. When you add more residential off-street spaces, vehicles tend to grow. We actually found that in 74% of census tracts in Los Angeles, there was what we call a convergence, meaning that the number of vehicles would move towards the number of spaces in those 74% of census tracts. Even if minimum parking requirements are reformed, you're going to have to work against a century of putting in parking infrastructure, this existing infrastructure that's in place. A lot of minimum parking reform efforts or parking reform efforts are focused on new parking. And that's great, but there needs to be efforts that are focused on the existing infrastructure as well. What we found in Los Angeles is where the greatest density of parking exists, which is in this sort of urban core downtown area, is also the place where new transit initiatives are concentrated and where population growth is mostly forecast. And the abundance of parking in that area is likely to work against transit adoption, getting people out of cars, reducing congestion in those areas. I mentioned this already. So transitioning parking, to me, there's a bunch of things that we need to think about. I'm not a sort of parking policy expert. I'm sure maybe there's some people in the room who are. But converting existing infrastructure to housing, commercial, industrial, even recreational space, to me, is critical. You have to undo this sort of existing infrastructure, and that means you have to take it over and do something else with it, including replacing surface lots with buildings. There's been a big push in Los Angeles, I'm not sure if this is the case throughout the rest of the U.S., to allow essentially garages that have been bootlegged, which is essentially turning them into residential units, to keep those sort of off-house units. And one of the challenges for homeowners to keep those has been minimum parking requirements. So while the city is supportive of turning garages into in-law apartments, minimum parking requirements have prevented people from being able to do that. So, that's one key area that we could see. And then focusing parking reform on particular areas, I think, is really critical, particularly areas that have a high density of parking already, but two, have reasonable transit service or are going to have reasonable transit service. We've seen this in LA. Here's the taking over of parking lots in Los Angeles around metro stations, those little M dots. I'll end there, and I'm happy to take questions. I think there's 10 or 15 minutes. There's a number of studies that this is based on. I'm just giving you the citations here. I left handouts. They're sort of in the back corner there of this actual study about parking. So if you want to take that with you, please do. Otherwise, I think this presentation is going to be available to you guys afterwards, so you can see the actual studies behind it. So with that, thank you very much. Any questions?
Have you looked to see if the encouragement of on-street bike parking has had any of the same encouragements of people buying bikes, any of the same trends?
Yeah. That's a great question, yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
So, you mentioned the life cycle of vehicles. What is that a time span that you're looking at? And how long is that time span?
Yeah, it's a good question. So each of those components in the life cycle, maybe that's what you're getting at, has different lifespans. So when you normalize, as it's called in life cycle assessment, you have to deal with the disparate time frames or the different lifetimes of certain components. So in the case of roads, which may last 20, 30, 40 years, you have to treat that differently than, say, a car that lasts 10, 15, 20 years, which is different than some other process that might be over the course of a day or two, right? Some maintenance activity. And that normalization requires you to do some sort of allocation procedure. So like in the case of roads, you have to think about how many cars are going to use that over a period of time and allocate to a particular PKT or PMT in that time frame.
Yeah, so you studied LA, which has a minimum parking policy, and you know that Portland has some maximum parking policy. So can you imagine, like, if you do a similar study in Portland about how much parking space exists here, and what can be the differences from?
Great question. Yeah. When did maximum parking standards become instituted in Portland? Are they recent or older?
Maybe 20 years.
20 years. Okay. So my guess is that, when you look at here, cumulative parking spaces over time, if you were to look at something similar for Portland, I'm guessing you had this sort of fast growth period, at which point there are maximum parking standards introduced, which would probably cut this off very quickly. It would probably cap the number of spaces and not allow that growth to continue on that trend that you were seeing. So my guess is there's some sort of inflection point in that growth of infrastructure when they were instituted. Whether they were instituted comprehensively across the city, I don't know, right? So
It's a metro.
Is it?
So it affects the entire region.
The region being the county or? Three counties,
Everything inside the urban growth county.
Yeah.
Curious about, when you're talking about the energy use of the sustainability piece of when you're looking at the transportation and you're looking at parking, how does that relate to kind of the energy use of a person, on a per capita? Is the driving and the transportation piece of our lives a huge percentage of our unsustainable practices?
Does anybody know the answer to that? I know. I'm going to see if you guys know. You should all know this. It is a large fraction. It's probably, it depends on where you are and how intense your driving is. In a place like Los Angeles, it can be as high as 40 to 50% of your total energy expenditures. In a place like Portland, maybe it's lower. I'm guessing in a place like Phoenix, it's upwards of 30, 40, 50%. It's pretty big. It's probably lower. I don't want to guess, but my intuition tells me it would be somewhere in the order of 20, 30%. If the city proper, not the New York metro region, where you have a large fraction of trips that are not by automobile. When you get into a place like Phoenix, so Los Angeles, a lot of people drive and they drive far. Phoenix, a lot of people drive and they drive far. When you add into that your energy budget for home, what you're using at your home for, conditioning of space in a place like Phoenix, and Phoenix has gorgeous weather, by the way, 8 months of the year. It's absolutely beautiful right now. But in those 4 months where it's really, really hot, your energy budget can be really, really high. And by the way, why do we care about energy? Whenever energy is involved with something, cost is involved. Things that are high costs are typically high energy footprints. Okay, so in Phoenix, you hear statistics like 80% of your energy is associated with home plus transport. There's a large fraction. Yeah. So usually when a city does an inventory of energy use or greenhouse gas emissions, transportation is usually 30, 40% of it. Back.
You said you sort of stopped short of calculating the quantity of parking as a relationship to inducing VMT.
Yeah.
But do I understand correctly, though, there is some correlation that you built here about inducing carbon?
About inducing carbon. There's correlation. There's not causation. Okay. There's definitely correlation. But I'm cautious about saying it is parking that's increasing automobile adoption and VMT because there are so many things we did not assess in this. I mean, we didn't assess changing fuel prices. We didn't assess, consumer behavior. We didn't assess all sorts of other things that, may or may not explain why the VMT went up when parking availability, or why ownership went up when parking availability went up. So I'm very cautious to do that. I think that it would be nice for somebody to take that on and do it. Maybe we'll do it, but it would be nice. Yeah.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
So I have 3 questions. So first, in terms of moving, looking forward, what are the things you would like to do, or what kind of data you would like to have to kind of go to the next level in terms of understanding this issue?
I don't know how much farther I want to take the parking work. Yeah. So to me, the parking work fits into a portfolio of studies that we've done on why infrastructure is the way that it is today. And we've done a similar study for roads, which you saw. We've done a study for buildings, which I didn't show you. And those together, to me, form this sort of foundation where we can think about changing infrastructure going forward. So there's lots of things I could see people doing with parking, like your question. There's lots of great things that I think we need to know about parking, and I'd like to see somebody take those on. In terms of how the infrastructure grew, we did a decent job. There's people who are doing like satellite data processing, right? So they're going in and they're saying, okay, here's the sort of convective energy releases, and these are the different bands of energy that are released, and we're capturing those in satellite readings, and we can basically figure out what is parking and what isn't. We did a project with Google where we did these sort of machine learning algorithms where we took a satellite photo and we said, okay, that's parking, that's parking, that's parking, that's parking, and then the software was able to figure out all the other parking that's out there. So I think that sort of refinement is the new data that I think could be played with, and maybe we can get things more accurate or learn more about like the behaviors that went on, in terms of what happened when parking went in. But to me, the sort of growth side of things is really a foundation for me to think about how to change infrastructure going forward. So like, to me, this is now a body of evidence of why we've done things one way or another, and the positive and negative things that have happened because of that. And as we now try to move into this 21st century of like adapting infrastructure for climate change, or adapting infrastructure for sustainability, or adapting infrastructure for social equity, or for mobility, or for whatever, these to me serve as nice foundations to kind of work from.
So my other question is, probably you don't have the data, but interesting to see the evolution of pricing and parking in terms of what percentage, and then of the surface, and then as a relation of the cost of ownership of a vehicle and commuting to downtown. Because I think in terms of changing behavior, that could be another.
Completely agree.
I mentioned this ParkMe website, which I don't know if you guys are familiar. I'm guessing it's for Portland as well. It's for a bunch of cities across the globe. But they are now actually collecting that data. And I don't know when they started, but I think we've reached this era of data collection on things like parking pricing, where 10, 20 years from now, I think you'll be able to look at it and say, okay, now I can do that study to see how parking pricing affected this or that.
The last one is the comment. Sometimes some people have some technological solutions, like say, well, we're going to have green pavements in terms of low energy and electric vehicles, so there is no so much in terms of emissions and so on. So it's a kind of very broad question, but how would you answer to say, well, we could have potential in the future, green pavement, green vehicles, and so on, and how that would impact,
You want me to answer purely from a technological perspective? I don't know. As an engineer, I'm skeptical that there are purely technological solutions to these problems. I mean, to me, it doesn't seem to make sense in any way to use land in a city for parking the way that we do. It doesn't make sense from a sort of technological perspective or a sort of land use perspective. It doesn't make sense from an economic perspective. It doesn't make sense from an environmental perspective, and so on. So, I could see, green pavements mitigating certain impacts, like impacts on hydrology or water flow, impacts on urban heat island. I would actually love to reproduce this study and see how it's impacted urban heat island, like in Phoenix. As you've added all this asphalt, the temperature of the city has gone up by, a degree, right? So it's all contributing. So there's ways in which we could sort of combat those effects. There are green asphalt people who are coming up with covering things. But to me, this is like a Band-Aid on a bigger wound. And I see kind of planning reform efforts as, being the bigger driver in this, decoupling minimum parking requirements from our regulations. But, it's Portland, I think, is a leader in doing these sorts of things. There are other cities that are leading in doing it. And I think there are other cities that will come along 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. I think Phoenix might be in that boat where they say, oh, you know what? We probably should have done that 10, 20, 30 years ago, and we didn't. And now, we expended a lot of, energy and a lot of impact because of not doing it.
I'm very curious to see what happens if autonomous vehicles become widespread. So to me, we already have autonomous vehicles in a sense. It's called Uber. So, basically, you get on your phone, you get a vehicle, show up at your doorstep, takes you where you want to go. You don't have to deal with the stress of driving.
Right.
The thing that holds people back from not using Uber more is price. If we can get autonomous vehicles to be, say, cheaper than public transportation, you would see people no longer use public transportation. Everyone who drives, a lot of people would switch to Uber for autonomous vehicles, and traffic congestion would increase. And my biggest fear is that everybody would have these vehicles or access to these vehicles, and they would want more roadway space to decrease congestion, the same problems we have faced for the past century. And I just don't see it being sustainable. I think there's a lot of negative effects of autonomous vehicles, and people aren't even considering them. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the big picture of transportation of autonomous vehicles.
I haven't given all that much thought to autonomous vehicles. So one, with autonomous vehicles, I see your arguments that you've got potentially, it's going to incentivize more people to use cars and not use transit. I could see that playing out, although I don't know if there's evidence that that is going to happen yet. I think it's something that we need to investigate and potentially combat if that's going to happen. I've heard the argument from people with certain political bends that autonomous vehicles, whatever level, category 3, 4, 5, the actual, truly autonomous vehicles, will create all sorts of efficiencies in travel that will, reduce congestion and will allow us to put 8 times as many cars on the road and still, be able to get us somewhere in a reasonable amount of time without significant congestion. I don't know what the future holds. We can be skeptical of these things, but I don't know which is which. I think regardless, what, connecting us to the sort of parking issue is that with autonomous vehicles, we still need to decouple minimum off-street parking requirements from, the use of this technology, right? So, if we're building stuff and have these minimum off-street requirements, whether we're using autonomous vehicles or not, we're still building parking. And a lot of that parking is currently, with the current dominant technology, which is non-autonomous vehicles, underutilized. It's not frequently used. So, there's still this sort of political or cultural, whatever it is, set of forces, I would call it path dependency or lock-in, that we need to figure out how to address. so that as things like autonomous vehicles or any other technology comes along, we need to decouple them from the sort of growth of the infrastructure, right? We're still dealing with this mentality from like 1920, 1930s of, everybody should have the ability to park their car somewhere. And, often that should be free. And I think that we need to sort of get out of this mentality in many places. I think we're out of time. Thank you all.